Welcome to Deloitte's Debrief Tax webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our corporate income tax series and is titled Emerging Production Linked Incentive Schemes. What's in it for you? My name is Neeru Ahuja and I'm a tax partner from Deloitte India based out of New Delhi. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I have two speakers with me today, Gulzar Didwania and P.S. Iswaran. Gulzar is also a tax partner with me in Gurgaon, and Iswaran is a consulting partner and a subject matter expert on supply chain management. Both are out of Deloitte, India. You may access our bios on the left side of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of the webcast console. First, all users are in a listen-only mode. If you have any content-related questions, you can submit at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to respond to your questions during the presentation. Second, all PC users can maximize or minimize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen. If you want to download today's slides and related publications, please go to the Downloads and Links box. On the other hand, mobile device users can view the slides and answer the survey on screen. Thirdly, if you require an attendance record for this event, you can download your CPE certificate by clicking the Request CPE icon at the bottom of the webcast console. Now, let me give you an overview of the topics we will discuss today. As you're aware, the discussion today is mainly about the PLI schemes or the profit-linked incentive schemes which the Indian government has introduced in the last 1 year. We will first get into the Indian economy and the context and the background, what happened and what were the triggers for bringing on these schemes. We will do a deep dive into these schemes. What is the concept? What is the coverage? Who are eligible? What are the benefits? So on and so forth. We will also discuss certain other key considerations like corporate income taxes, structuring, etc. Finally, we will be sharing some case studies, some learnings and experiences with our audience today. And of course, we will have some questions in the end. With that, let me hand over to my colleague Iswaran to talk about the background and set the context. So Iswaran, over to you.
Thank you, Neeru, for the introductions. What I would do in the next few minutes is to lay a context of what the Indian economy is all about and why the production-linked incentive schemes came in perspective. So if you really look at where we are as an economy and, even taking into consideration what we are going through now in terms of the pandemic, I think one of the fundamental tenets of the Indian economy has been that there is a strong projection for the GDP in the coming year. Every analyst is looking at anywhere upwards of about 10% for the GDP and going up to about 13.7%. Now, one of the reasons for this being discussed is also the way in which the economy had reacted over the last 1 year or so. And if you look to the graph on the right, you would find that there is a V-shaped recovery that the economy went through. Take two dimensions of it, both the durables as well as the non-durable goods. The durable goods being a proxy for urban demand in India, and the non-durable goods being a proxy for rural demand. And both of them, you would notice, went through a steep acceleration in terms of growth between April of 2020 and then now in January, which is the latest data that we have. While we expect a minor blip in the month of April, given the pandemic, the expectation is that with the vaccination in context, we should be able to go forward pretty well. So sum and substance of it is, I think there is a strong growth which is being envisaged, and with the V-shaped recovery in perspective, the foundational elements are in place for us to move forward. So it's in this context that the government started looking at dimensions to accelerate the Make in India theme. And if you can move to the next slide. Um, yeah. One of the key characteristics of that recovery or the V-shaped recovery that you saw has been the policies that the government of India had the previous year to encourage manufacturing, as well as replacing a lot of private investments with investments from the government. So one of the big areas that they focused on the prior year was around infrastructure. So a 1.4 trillion investment plan in infrastructure over the next 5 years is something that has been a big part of the journey and also driven a lot of consumption in the previous year. The second one, as part of that, is when the Make in India program got announced in May of 2020. And as part of that, a $380 billion package, which has since been augmented substantially as part of the special economic package to deal with the pandemic-related implications and disruptions. The third, as part of the larger journey for manufacturing, 15 champion sectors have been announced. And you would notice as we move forward later that in these 15 champion sectors is where a lot of incentive subsidies to attract the manufacturing in India and the value addition in India has been provided for. And with that, what has also been done is not just incentives, not just push towards infrastructure and not just the identification of the champion sectors. Reforms have also happened in the enabling areas. So we've now come up with reforms around labor. So there is a high degree of flexibility that is being provided to global investors. There are also incentives and subsidies at the provincial level or at the state level, which run parallel to the incentives as well as the subsidies which are provided at the federal or at the central level. And the third most important, there is also a big thrust on tax reforms, reforms around making the supply chain far more effective through what we call inbound manufacturing, direct tax related reforms, which Neeru will speak about later, as well as the thrust on what we call the domestic value addition in India, which makes it far more feasible for global organizations to source out of India as well as manufacture out of India. So that's essentially the big context in which the government really launched a set of reforms and schemes to enable the manufacturing in India, and the production-linked incentive schemes that we will speak about is one big area for that. What has led to this? If you really look at it, we spoke about a 10+% growth the coming year, as well as a set of investments that the government is able to make. Now, what has enabled this is 2-3 things. The first thing is that, India's external debt to GDP is very low. It is at about 20.6%, which means that most of the debt is very, very domestic and therefore very, very controllable. So to that extent, I think the country is very insulated from any external shock that we would have from a debt perspective. The second one is that the foreign exchange reserves are very close to about 600 billion right now. During the course of the pandemic, moved up from about 480 billion to 575, 60 billion or so. So to that extent, there is a big thrust on forex reserves, which are also there, which makes the ability of the government to spend far more attractive and easier. The third one is that with all the reforms that have happened, the ease of doing business rankings have also gone up substantially. Somewhere from about 70%, 79 points have been, or rather places have been moved up, and now at about 63 from what was very close to about 150 or so earlier. So all these makes it also easier for the government to now push the thrust on manufacturing and therefore the reforms around the manufacturing that we spoke about. If you can move to the next slide, and I'll very quickly touch upon what the PLI is before giving it to Gulzar. I think the context of the PLI is very simple. The government came up with a model where they wanted to attract manufacturing investments into India and therefore boost domestic value addition. Therefore, the best way to do that, they thought, was to really look at incremental sales over a base year, and on the incremental sales over the base year, return a part of that as incentive to companies for them to make it attractive. Therefore, what they have done is in each of the base year programs, about 5 to 6% on a minimum, going up to about 10 to 12% in specific sectors. On the invoice value, net of taxes, you get as a refund, which is the production-linked incentive program. And you align that to value addition requirements, as well as to minimum investment thresholds that the government has laid out specific for each sector. Gulzar will talk about it. So the objective was really to start looking at shifting the value chains by making Indian manufacturing far more competitive and therefore make India a very viable hub for global value chain participation. The second one is incentivize value addition in India. That's essentially the second one. And with that in context, a lot of import substitution, especially in core sectors like pharmaceuticals that we spoke about. And finally, I think one major dimension of it is WTO compliant. And therefore, there are no concerns for global organizations who access these schemes and therefore have the ability to sustainably deploy it over the many years. So Niru, with that in context and the perspective of the strong growth projected for the subsequent years, the foundational elements being in place in terms of both the forex reserves as well as the external debt to GDP, etc., and the investments that have already been made by the government, is how the production-linked incentive schemes have been configured. Now, the early part of the PLI, before I hand over to you, Niru, early part of the PLI, which has been around pharmaceuticals and large-scale electronics manufacturing, has been a significant success. The number of applicants have been substantially more than the number of approvals that the government had envisaged for each one of them. So that's the context in which it is being laid out, and very WTO compliant with a strong commitment towards manufacturing. So Niru, back to you for the next sessions.
Thank you so much, Ishwaran. That was very insightful and helpful. Now we will have a polling question for our audience, and our question is really as follows. Does your organization have a manufacturing facility in India, or you have plans to set up one in the near term? And the options which are available are, yes, we do have a manufacturing facility, additionally looking to expand. Second option is we have an existing facility, but we are not looking to expand. The third option is no, we do not have manufacturing footprint in India, but we are evaluating it. Next option is we do not have one in India and we are not even considering. And the last is I don't know, or this question does not apply. So while we are waiting for the audience to cast their vote on these options, Ishwaran, I had a quick question for you, if you can come in. So my question was really, if a foreign company does not set up the plant from scratch, but goes and buys one brownfield, then will the scheme be applicable or not?
Yes. So Niru, if the organization accesses a brownfield facility, the two conditions which are there are, one, if that facility has a sales of X, the incremental sale is what will be counted on that. So that is one part of the story. The second one is in each of the schemes, there are also dimensions of investment that is being planned, the incremental investment that is being planned. And therefore, depending on the sectors that you're looking at, some of them have value addition percentages, some of them would have the incremental revenue requirement, and the third also the incremental investment that is being planned. So you can access the brownfield facility and still claim the PLI. We just need to look at the sector and look at the fine print around, what are the specific conditions for that sector. So for example, pharmaceuticals has a little bit of a variation compared to large scale electronics and compared to, let's say, domestic electronics. So these are the couple of things.
Thank you, Ishwaran. And we do have the results of the poll. So if we take out the people for whom this question doesn't apply, we do find that a majority of you already have a manufacturing facility in India and even looking at or interested in expanding it. So that's very heartening. I hope you will like to hear the next part of our session as we get into the details of the production-linked incentive scheme. So thank you very much, Ishwar, and let's move on now to the next part. And Gulzar, if I can invite you now give us all the details of the scheme, etc., please.
Thank you, Neeru and Iswar, for setting the context right. While we have already discussed at the high level objectives and significance of the PLI scheme in the previous slides, I would like to get into more details and talk about its coverage, quantum of incentives offered under the scheme, the process involved, and our experience of the first PLI scheme launched last year. The overall planned incentive outlay under all the PLI schemes is nearly around INR 2 trillion approximately, which is over $26 billion, spread across a period of 5 to 6 years. The key benefits of these schemes are as follows. A, it provides incentives in the range of 2% to 15% on incremental sales made of eligible products over the base year. In majority of the schemes notified or approved by the cabinet so far, the base year has been assigned as FY 2019-2020. The scheme also covers both domestic as well as export sales made of eligible products, and it can be combined with any other central as well as state government schemes or incentives offered under any other schemes. We'll talk about those things in detail in subsequent slides. The scheme also takes care of various aspects of ease of doing business, such as there is no restriction in making the investment at a specific location. The manufacturing unit can be set up anywhere in the country. Secondly, the scheme does not have any export obligations attached to it, and therefore it makes it WTO compliant. And finally, unlike various state incentive schemes, there are no restrictions imposed on disposal of assets, only after a specified period. The potential beneficiaries of the schemes are companies with significant existing global sales, as the PLI schemes are focused on inviting global players to set up their manufacturing facilities in India. Second, businesses intending to shift manufacturing facilities from other countries to India. And finally, Indian brands. The scheme also wants to make global domestic champions. So Indian brands or companies with significant existing business volumes and looking to further expand their manufacturing footprints into India. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so broadly, there are about 12 sectors that the government has covered under the ambit of PLI scheme, with specific incentive outlay for each sector. You can see in the slide the current status, the amount of incentive approved, and which ministry is looking into these incentives. So, for example, there's steel, telecom, solar, automobile, and so on. So initially the scheme for 3 sectors, which is mobile phones, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals, drugs and APIs, were notified in 2020. And a lot of applications were filed and the approvals were also granted. Following a positive response from these sectors, phase 2 of the PLI scheme was approved for additional sectors later in November 2020. Moving on to the next slide. Till date, PLI schemes for 6 sectors have been notified, which include pharmaceutical drugs, medical devices, mobile phones and electronic components. Of course, these 3 were in phase 1. In phase 2, we also have pharmaceutical drugs, then electronic and technology products, telecom and networking products, and white goods. We are still waiting for the final notifications for specialty steel, automobile, textile, and advanced chemistry cell batteries. Further, the draft scheme for food products and solar modules have been approved by the cabinet, and they should also be notified soon, is what we understand. For the remaining sectors, schemes are currently under discussion before respective ministries and are expected to be approved by cabinet in the coming weeks. Moving on to the next slide, please. After having discussed the sectors covered by the government under the PLI scheme, along with the amount of incentives approved, let us now discuss and understand some of the key aspects which organizations should keep in mind while deciding their investment strategies. Firstly, right sizing of the investment is very, very critical, because one of the key criteria for PLI scheme eligibility is the amount of investment sought to be made in a phased manner, right? So every scheme has different investment slab, which has to be made within a different time frame. So that's very, very important for us to do the right sizing of the investment. The investment, again, requirement differ from each scheme. So it is essential to compute investment to be committed in terms of detailed guidelines issued under the scheme. This would involve identifying specific exclusions and inclusions of the assets which are eligible for consideration as fixed capital investments. For example, investment in land is typically excluded from the total investment that is planned. And accordingly, one, while doing the planning for the investment, needs to take care of these aspects, that what is excluded and what is included. Similarly, any second-hand machinery, of course, there are some flexibilities available, but otherwise that investment is not eligible. Second aspect is fitment of your product portfolio. Now, the coverage of the products intended to be manufactured in the scheme is an important determinant for scheme eligibility. Also, it would be important to compute baseline sales and draw up sales projections for the scheme period after taking into consideration the incremental production capacity and associated sales volumes. A third aspect, and very, very important, is technology. And that's what even the government has been eyeing for, that companies with cutting-edge technology should come and invest. So technology used by the applicant in their products is also being considered as one of the key differentiators when the applications are being scrutinized for eligibility. Thus, employing cutting-edge, state-of-the-art technology would always have an edge in terms of final shortlisting of the applicants. Fourth and very important aspect is the reduction in import content and more thrust to domestic value addition. Schemes are being designed to ensure that a minimum domestic value addition is achieved, and also, the incentives percentage also ranges from if you are having more domestic value addition, then you may be entitled for more incentives, and if you are having less domestic value addition, then either the incentive is lower or the benefit may not be eligible at all. Can we move to the next slide, please? In the previous slide, we talked about the key areas of consideration for deciding the eligibility under the PLI scheme. However, another important aspect for organizations is to not see PLI scheme as a stand-alone incentive scheme while taking the investment decisions. One needs to take a holistic view and align the investment plan with other schemes' incentives, tax benefits available under the law. As mentioned before, PLI scheme allows applicants to avail benefits simultaneously under multiple incentive schemes, such as state incentives, and therefore common aspects and cross linkages between various schemes need to be evaluated to maximize the synergies. Some of the important areas that the companies need to carefully examine include alignment with similar requirements under targeted state incentive policies, investment commitment, business projections, SWOT analysis submitted before state authorities. All those things should align while applying for the PLI scheme as well. Combination with other schemes, such as customs bonded warehouse manufacturing scheme, income tax incentives, central government export schemes, etc., to maximize the benefits in view of the business plans. Again, legal entity structuring for the benefits under income tax and alignment with transfer pricing is also very, very important aspect. So for markup in case of multi-entity structure, contract manufacturing model where investment is made by vendors, requirement for new legal entity for benefits under corporate income tax. These are the other aspects that are also relevant for while making the investment decisions under the PLI schemes. Other critical investment decisions, such as commercial production in multiple phases, greenfield facility vis-a-vis expansion, acquisition of existing brownfield facility, conservative versus bullish investment commitments, etc. So I think one has to take a holistic view while making an investment decisions, and PLI is not the only driver. And there are a lot of other incentives, benefits which are available, which one should always combine while making an investment decision. With this, let me now hand it over to Neeru, who would take the discussion forward from here. Over to you, Neeru.
Thank you so much, Gulzar, for those details. And to our audience, we have another poll for you. And our question is, are you aware of the various incentive schemes available in India for setting up of manufacturing? And the options you have are 1, yes, and we are already availing benefits. 2, no, but we are reviewing the schemes to understand the applicability to our plans and existing operations in India. The third option is, so far we are not aware. I hope you will want to know more. And the fourth option is, we really don't know. So let's check the pulse of our audience here, Gulzar, as to their awareness. And meanwhile, Gulzar, I have a question for you on contract manufacturing. You know, sometimes companies really don't manufacture themselves, but outsource the manufacturing. So would the incentives under the PLI scheme also apply in those cases?
So Niru, I think, typically currently the benefit that is available is to investment made by the manufacturer for the purpose of manufacturing in his own plant and machinery in his own factory. But we see there are some draft guidelines which do allow incentives even if the investment is made by the contract manufacturer. It was not there in the first phase of PLI scheme, but we do believe that a lot of representations have been made, and accordingly, companies may look for investment through contract manufacturers in case they want to avail the PLI scheme incentives. So and we will see when the fine print of draft the PLI guidelines come out.
Sure. Thanks, Gulzar. So
over to you, Neeru.
Here we have the answers now. So the good news is that a chunk of the people are aware, but there is an equally large not aware. So and there are some who are studying. So our recommendation to you all would be that this is a fairly liberal scheme, as you would have heard from the conversations with Ishwar and Gulzar. The number of conditions or caveats is very few. It's a pretty open liberal scheme. So if you have not already availed, you should definitely look at it, is our strong recommendation. So thank you, Gulzar. We'll move on to the next section, which is about other tax considerations which Gulzar mentioned while he was talking to us. So obviously, while the PLI scheme is a cash incentive scheme, let us also understand if there are any other benefits or incentives available under the corporate income tax rules. Now, on this slide, we have presented the various corporate income tax rates which apply in India. It's a little complicated table, but I did want to show to you the range of tax rates applicable in India to companies doing business in India. And as you would see, the highest tax rate is in the 40s, whereas some of the lowest tax rates, and I've got a highlighter, is 17.16%. And this is precisely the tax rate which applies if you set up a new manufacturing company on or after 1st October 2019. Now, 17.16 is a hugely competitive rate. It really brings down your effective tax rate for doing business in India. And it's a huge incentive the government has given for the purpose of manufacturing. So not only can you avail the cash PLI incentive, you can also look forward to a very reduced corporate income tax rate. Let's move on to the next slide to understand other nuances of corporate income tax. Now, I've got two parts on this slide. On the left side, we will talk about the requirement relating to legal entity structuring. And the right side, we'll talk about the funding options. So first, let's have a quick look at the legal entity structuring. So unlike the PLI scheme, where there is no condition regarding a legal entity, a separate legal entity per se, for availing the lower income tax rate, which I just showed, you do need to set up a new company in India. And it could possibly simplistically be done in two ways. And these are the two options you see on the left side of the screen. Either if you have an existing Indian company, the Indian company could set up another subsidiary under as a second tier. Alternatively, there could be another direct investment from the foreign company into another new Indian company. So you could look at either options, but it is necessary to set up a new company to avail the lower income tax rate. Of course, the benefits of having a subsidiary under an existing company is that you are able to consolidate to some extent, not in India maybe, but overseas. The valuations also get rolled up. So it could be different for different companies, but these are broadly the two simple options. On the right side, we see that there are options with regard to funding as well. Now, the PLI scheme does not really insist that you bring in the money as equity. So you are allowed to get debt as well. And on this chart, we have shown the various forms in which you could bring in the investment into India. It could be equity shares, it could be preference shares, it could be convertible debentures, it could be loans, it could be local loans as well. So several options are there, and the corporate income tax rate also does not look at any particular funding option, does not prescribe rather. Obviously, from a tax efficiency point of view, a loan works better than equity because you're able to claim a tax deduction for the interest, and also you're able to repatriate the money when the loan repayment happens. So broadly, these are some related tax considerations which can be looked at for the purpose of planning investment into manufacturing. Moving on. Thank you. We have some other incentives under the income tax law, and sometimes we find with our clients that these are not so well known. Therefore, I'll spend some time talking about these. On the left side, we have a deduction. This is a tax deduction which reduces your taxable income. It is under Section 80JJAA of the Income Tax Act. Now, what is this incentive? This incentive relates to new employees hired by a company. So if a company hires new employees, it is able to get an additional deduction of 30% from its taxable income for 3 years. Now, let me take a simple example. If you're paying salary of 100 to a new employee, you not only will you get the 100 as a tax deduction, you will in addition get 30 plus 30 plus 30. So 90 is the additional tax deduction you will get over the next 3 years. So this is a very interesting tax benefit which is available. Now, the key condition to this incentive, of course, I mentioned that the employee has to be new. This is also meant to benefit lower paid employees. Therefore, employees whose emoluments or compensation is not more than 25,000 rupees per month, or translated into dollars, around $350 per month. Another condition is that the people should be employed for at least 150 days and 240 days in case of other companies. 150 applies to seasonal industries like apparel, footwear, and leather, and 240 days for other industries. So even if you hired a new employee, not at the beginning of the year, but during the year, you may be eligible for the additional tax deduction. And the last condition is that the employee should be participating in a recognized provident fund, which is a government approved social security scheme that operates in India. Now, interestingly, this deduction is perhaps the only deduction which is available in case of lower corporate income tax rates also. So if you recall, the Indian government slashed the corporate income tax rates about a year and a half back, saying that if you are getting any tax incentives, you will not be eligible for the lower rate. but this is the only exception to that rule. So what I am trying to say, in other words, is even if you're availing a lower corporate income tax rate, while other tax holidays may not be available to you, this is an incentive that is still available. So do look it up. Many times companies do not really get into the details or feel that this incentive is not substantial, but we have in our analysis found it otherwise. So do look it up. The other related to employment generation, the other incentive, which is the right side box, is the Atmanirbhar Bharat Rozgar Yojana. In this, the government contributes again to hiring of new employees, lower paid employees. Here the threshold for lower pay is slightly lower. What does the government do? It reimburses or it pays to the employer the 12% contribution to be made to the Provident Fund. So if I back up a bit, under the Provident Fund scheme, the employer and the employee each are required to contribute 12% of their salary for future pensions. And under this scheme, the government will contribute this 12% for you. In the case of large organizations, more than 1,000 employees, the government will contribute only the employee's contribution. Whereas in case of smaller companies where you have less than 1,000 employees, government will contribute both 12% employer plus employees 12%. So 24% of the salary which you would have been otherwise a cost would be contributed by the government. So both these incentives are substantial and they relate to new employment generation. You should definitely have a look at these. So moving on. We have a quick question for you just to understand where you are in terms of your effective corporate tax rate. Obviously taking into account the incentives and the lower rates. Are you pay at less than 20% of effective corporate tax rate in India? Or are you at between the 20 to 30% range? Third option is you're paying actually more than 30% corporate income tax in India. Next option is you're not taxable in India. That's good, or it doesn't apply, the question. So request you to please log in ballpark where your tax rate, effective tax rate in India. So with that, Gulzar, if I can request you to come in. And a quick question again on the PLI scheme. Is it very costly to go for this scheme, to apply? Is there a fees? What are the costs and expenses a company has to incur in applying for this benefit?
Thanks, Neeru. The process of filing the application under the PLI scheme, I mean, definitely it is not a costly affair at all. A minimal amount of application fee that one has to pay. And of course, that's why basis that, the application can be processed and everything is online. So of course, one has to be a genuine applicant to apply for the PLI scheme, but definitely it is not a costly affair at all. So my experience in the last scheme has been same, that of course, if you have an investment to make, filing the application, processing it definitely is not a costly affair.
Sure, thanks. So do we have the answers? Okay, so Gulzar, if you see, a lot of the audience here is actually paying tax between 20 to 30%. And there are some folks who are even paying more than 30%. So to these members of the audience who are actually paying more than 30 or even close to the higher 20s, we do recommend you analyze where the taxes are being paid and what schemes or incentives may be applicable in your case, which you are not really availing. And of course, we'll be happy to get into further details on a one-on-one basis. Right. So with that discussion, we will move to the next part of our session. And this, of course, is the most important one. We've understood the rules, we've understood the context. And now let's talk of some of the practical aspects. And of course, the schemes are new. We are still experiencing. Government is also still learning from its experiences. So, Gulzar, I know you have been engaged with our clients. You've actually processed some of these applications with success. So I'll hand it over to you to share, your thoughts on the experiences and learnings so far.
Thank you, Neelu. So, on this chart, we will talk about at a high level what is the process involved for applying for the PLI scheme and what is the overall, activities that one has to do if one has actually applied for the PLI scheme. So the overall process involved in the filing application and obtaining incentives can be divided into two categories. Phase one is the process of filing the application and getting the approval. And phase two is post-approval compliance and, of course, disbursal of the incentives. First phase involves collecting necessary documentation and review of information which has to be submitted to the project management agency. So government appoints project management agencies for every PLI scheme, and therefore, there's a list of documents that one has to collect, one has to prepare and submit as part of the online application. Once the application is submitted online, deficiencies, if at all there are any deficiencies, PMA, the project management agency, typically communicate those deficiency either through the portal or over emails. And in fact, if there are certain clarifications which an investor has, he can actually write those clarifications to the PMA even before filing the applications, and they do respond on time. And in fact, whenever PMA also has any queries, they generally expect that one responds on time. So after submission of all the necessary documents, the information, PMA thereafter prepares one sort of, recommendation report. And they share that recommendation report, which is also known as project appraisal report, with the empowered committee. And empowered committees typically consist of, the secretary level bureaucrats, which are either part of the respective ministry who is taking care of the scheme, and also there are representatives from Niti Aayog as well. So there is a quorum which is part of the empowered committee, and then empowered committee takes the final vote. Once the application is approved and communicated to the investor, there are certain formalities that the investor needs to complete, which is to submit a specified amount of bank guarantee depending upon the incentive and investment that is required. And also, there is one undertaking that one has to submit, and all these things are clearly outlined in the approval letter that is issued to the investor by the project management agency. So this is the process of filing the application and getting the approval. Thereafter, the second phase involves post-approval compliance, wherein the company would need to compute the amount of incentives based on the actual investment made and the incremental sales generated. Basis the amount so computed, the applicants would then prepare and file their disbursal applications. This phase would also typically include preparation and filing of various kinds of documents, compliance reports, because the PMA wants to monitor that how the investor is progressing in terms of the investment, in terms of the sales, etc. So they do ask typically for quarterly reports and quarterly status update on the investments that one has to make. Of course, lastly, once I have made the investment, I have made the incremental sales, I would apply for the incentives, and there is a process that will be followed, and thereafter the incentive will be disbursed in cash. Moving on to the next slide, please. After discussing the broad process of what are the steps involved under a PLI scheme, let me now share our experience in assisting companies file their applications in the initially launched PLI scheme last year. The first and foremost learning that we have is that one should proactively evaluate the opportunities under this scheme. and get into action immediately, considering that the window for filing the application is quite narrow. This will not only help in avoiding any last-minute rush, but also help in getting desired clarity, in writing, of course, from the authorities on certain gray areas. And we actually did that while, assisting companies in filing the PLI applications in the first phase. So the authorities actually reacted or provided clarifications very proactively. Apart from this point, what we have also experienced that the government, in case of PLI scheme, is quite receptive to the changes and schemes and guidelines based on industry feedback. We have actually submitted feedback from the industry on the previous PLI scheme, and government has actually made changes in the guidelines that they have finally issued, which actually helped industries in a big way. Secondly, the scheme also prescribes standard benefits, which are applicable to all shortlisted applicants. And there is no provision for customized package or special incentives on a case-to-case basis. So it's a pretty transparent process, and therefore actually there are no ifs and buts with respect to the incentives that will be granted to an investor. As far as processing of applications are concerned, recognized financial institutions, as I mentioned, are appointed as PMA for overall management and facilitation. Thus, one can expect that a PMA which follows a professional approach, has clarity on scheme requirements, and acts as a responsive facilitator proposal submission and interface with the authorities. So that's all I have actually experienced while interacting the project management authority in the first phase of the scheme. Thereafter, the selection criteria prescribed in the scheme is also very, very transparent and merit-based, such as the turnover, proposed investment, and expenditure on research and development, etc. Also, the timelines for filing the application, scrutiny of the application is very clearly outlined in the detailed guidelines. And these timelines have been strictly adhered in the last phase, where once the application window was closed, the PMA had 90 days to process and provide approval to all the applicants. So actually that timeline was followed. And I think there were no extensions that were actually granted. Finally, the entire process of filing application, coordination with the PMA, responding to the queries during the application scrutiny, till the date of issual of approval order is completely online. Even post-approval compliance, such as, as I mentioned, bank guarantee submission, undertaking submission, everything happened, without any human interface. So the clarifications were provided through, phone calls, MS Teams meetings, etc. But actually everything was without any human interface. So to summarize, if I have to summarize, then I can say one can expect a clear and transparent process of approval followed by the government, which is professionally managed with the use of technology. And therefore, I don't expect that, once somebody has taken an investment decision, filing of the application, interaction, it's completely professionally managed and very, very transparent process. So with this, now let me hand it over to you, Niru, again to take the discussion forward. Over to you, Niru.
Thank you, Gulzar, for those details and sharing some practical insights. I'm sure those will be very useful for our audience members as they look at going in for the scheme. So we will now get into some question answer session, and we do have a lot of questions around these schemes. So Ishwar, my first question is to you from our audience member. Does this PLI scheme apply to footwear manufacturing company? Ishwar? Maybe you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you, Ishwar.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about this.
Yeah.
Made the mistake. So footwear has been identified as a priority sector, and therefore there is a PLI which is expected for footwear. As Gulzar rightly mentioned, guidelines for some of them have been announced. Guidelines and quantum for some of the others have not been announced. But we expect a PLI for footwear shortly. the government has already identified them as a preferred manufacturing portfolio for PLI.
Right, thank you. That's a quick one. The next one is how does the percentage work, X% incentive, how does it really work? And maybe if you can give a simple example, that will be helpful, Ishwaran.
Yeah. So the percentage is not a corporate tax rate percentage. The percentage is the percentage of the invoice value net of taxes that you get as a refund. So for example, if you take pharmaceuticals, and where the biggest push has been given the context of the pandemic, depending on which active pharmaceutical ingredient and which key starting material or raw material it is, the band was 10% or 20% of the invoice value. Whereas for rest of the sectors, it has been typically between 4 to 6% of the invoice value. So if you take some of the new announcements which have been made, it's about 4%, large-scale electronics manufacturing at about 5%, some of the others at 6%. So 4 to 6% typically, but a couple of sectors have been outliers at about 10% like pharmaceuticals. So two clarifications. One is it is not on the corporate tax rate. It is on the invoice value net of taxes. And the second one is typically you should expect the refund to be in the range of 4 to 6% of that value.
Right, so it's an incentive based on the turnover essentially, right?
Yes, it is on incremental sales over the base year. The incremental sales is over the base year. The base year for all the guidelines which have been issued till recently has been 2019-20. As we move forward, possibly the base year would change depending on which year it is coming. But it's over incremental sales over the base year, Niru, on which the refund is being provided for.
So since it's on the top line, it could be pretty substantial, right? It could be
exactly.
A substantial number.
So if you really look at, just because you mentioned that point, if you really look at it, the typical EBITDA of companies, except for some of the high growth industries, are typically in the range of about 12 to 15%. Therefore, if you really look at that and you're talking about a plowback of about 4 to 6%, it is literally about 50% of the companies would typically be running. So that is something that you may want to keep in context. And as Gulzar rightly said, I think that's a point to note. What most organizations are looking at is that they are really looking at triangulating all the 2 or 3 big incentive packages that are coming in. One is what you spoke, Niru, on the entire corporate tax rate. The second one is around the production-linked incentives itself, which is giving them that 4 to 6%. And the third one, we also have the inbound manufacturing program, where for any material which is imported, be it for trading, be it for domestic consumption, be it for exports, you really don't pay the customs duty at the point of import. You really pay the duty as applicable only when it is shipped to the customer for domestic use. And if you are exporting it and if there is no import duty applicable, then you don't pay duty in the chain at all. So if you really look at it, that will typically translate into roughly a percentage to 1.5% of total cost in our experience of companies, which means that on top of the PLI, you also get another 1.5% as inbound manufacturing. So, and to top it up, the corporate tax rate that you spoke about. So Niru, really looking at it, this makes it a pretty attractive portfolio of benefits for companies to access. And most important, I think it's also very significant that all these can happen in parallel.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. So if we shift gears a little, Ishwaran, I have another question, and this is more about the Indian economy and the state of affairs in India currently. And the question is as follows: that India is we are in the middle of the second wave of the infection, and there have been reports of infections going up. And what is the likely impact of this, which is going to happen on the economy in the near term and in the longer term? Do you think this could impact some of the plans, or this is a short-term blip So your perspective, Ishwaran.
So two things, Neeru, just very factually too, rather than being emotional. The first one is, Neeru, one of the biggest drivers of the economy, like what I said earlier, has been the continued thrust of public investments, which is the government investments into the marketplace, be it in terms of infrastructure, be it in terms of PLI, be it in terms of inbound manufacturing or the other incentives and subsidies. So therefore, to that extent, the foundational elements are really being insulated from some of the private consumption related aspects associated with the pandemic. So that's one. The second one that Neeru, you may want to be cognizant of is the fact that even this situation that we are looking at right now, if I take the last 1 week in perspective, I think the number of cases have either remained stable or are coming down. So quite naturally, there has been a steep increase in the last couple of weeks, but I think there is a fair degree of action that has been done by both the provincial as well as the federal governments. And to that extent, I think while we expect a short-term blip, which is quite natural, in the months of April until the mid of May, I think going forward, they should be able to neutralize themselves from that. So in the medium term, really don't see a big impact of this. Obviously, short term, looking at the manufacturing index of April and May, you would quite naturally have a blip in the indices.
Right. And in fact, Ishwaran, I remember when we were talking to our clients in January and February, they confirmed that they are back at pre-COVID levels of sales or even more than that. So I think the fundamentals are very strong and people get back on their feet very quickly here. I mean, we all would agree with that.
As we mentioned in the first chart, Neeru, if you really look at the V-shaped recovery and the time it took to come back to the pre-COVID levels, it was already by December that they were there. And by January, they were looking at growth, both on the rural as well as on the urban side. And naturally, the last month and a half, there would be a blip given the actions that are there. But we would expect that to be a short-term blip.
Sure. Thank you so much. Gulzar, a quick question for you, and then we'll have to close. So Gulzar, the question is, if we come to you for help on making this application, how much time does it take really to collect all the information in your experience to prepare the application, file it, and then to get the approval? So rough idea on the timelines, if you can share, Gulzar.
So Neeru, I think in my experience, if we start, let's say now, subject to we having clarity on what information, etc., we required to submit in the based on the guidelines, it typically takes 3 to 4 weeks in compiling the entire information. There are iterations that takes place, there are discussions that takes place, and therefore I would presume that a 3 to 4 weeks time is a sufficient enough time for us to prepare, discuss, and file the application. Once we file the application, then of course the authorities in any case, they have very, very tight timelines to close the applications, provide the approvals, and hence they typically follow those timelines. They would come to you for any queries that they have, and we have to respond quickly so that the project can be appraised and the approvals can be granted. So yes, 3 to 4 weeks time for preparation and filing, and thereafter government will stick to their timelines. That's the experience that I have, Neeru.
And what are the government timelines? Another 2 to 3 weeks or a couple of months?
I think, so last time it was 3 months, Neeru. So you can typically feel the entire process can get completed within 4 months.
Okay, thank you so much, Gulzar. I'm sure people will hold you to that timeline. So that, unfortunately, is the time all we have for today. Again, Ishwaran and Gulzar, thank you so much, and a special thanks to all of you who were able to join us. We would like to encourage you to fill out the short survey that will pop up on your screen momentarily and tell us about what you think of today's program. If you've joined us late, please note that the presentation will be archived for future viewing. If you feel others would benefit from this webcast, please share the webcast via the share this icon or have them visit the debrief site. We will respond to all the questions submitted during the webcast in a couple of weeks' time. Also, if you think of any other questions, comments later, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We will be more than happy to talk to you. And please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast from the Transfer Pricing series on 6 May, titled Transfer Pricing Implications of the Effects of COVID-19 and the Recent Developments in Southeast Asia. At last, from all of us at Deloitte, thank you very much for your participation in Deloitte's Asia Pacific Tax webcast today. Goodbye.